be talking about developing a local program, and I will introduce people on the panel, and then I'll give you a little intro about my experience in this. This is Carmel Angelo. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Mendocino County. Judy Morris, County Supervisor Trinity, and James Gore is on the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors. James, Judy, and I are also on the CSAC Cannabis Working Group. The story of how we got to this point would, I think, require about a 400-page book. And it might be my retirement project, but I don't know. As it became clear that the industry and their clients were moving toward another ballot measure, and the legislature stepped up and began the process of creating and passing what is known as the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, they did that in order to ensure that there would be regulations that would underpin anything that voter initiative would bring forward. Early on, it became clear that the cannabis picture was very different in different regions. Up here, we mainly have cultivators and manufacturers with a few dispensaries, and it's been going on for a long time. The Bay Area and South have the vast majority of clients and dispensaries, and then you have counties that have an even mix, counties that have a bunch of personal grows and not much else, and counties that do not traditionally have much of a cannabis presence at all. As the legislature amped up their efforts at Humboldt's cultivators began a lobbying effort aimed at either putting a local ordinance on the ballot or having the county move forward with a board initiative ordinance. We eventually opted for a board initiative, and our board appointed me and Supervisor Sundberg to an ad hoc committee to deal with all the various aspects of getting that ordinance in place. We also opted for initiating a track and trace pilot program with SIPCA, and we worked with our agricultural commissioner on that part of the program. After numerous stakeholder meetings, interagency meetings, and meetings of the board, we crafted our current ordinance and passed it with a mitigated negative declaration. In order to do that, our ordinance was very restrictive, more so than the state. We came up with a protocol that defined what constituted an existing grow for purposes of compliance with state regs, and we also came up with a process to define good standing. An important part of this historic swivel from a well-established black market to a regulated one, from prohibition to permitting, was and is working with the community. It also entails working with our neighboring counties and protecting our region's security, environment, and economic standing. On top of all that, we put an excise tax tied to permitted businesses on the ballot, which passed with a significant majority. This has entailed a lot of work on everyone's part, and the work continues, and I would like to say will continue for quite some time. It's not done when you pass an ordinance. We were not sure how many people would come forward to be permitted, but we were pleasantly surprised when the closing date we had received about 2,300, actually in excess of 2,300 applications. Why do you think we're pleasantly surprised? Well, because we know from anecdotal evidence that we probably have about 8,000 to 10,000 unpermitted grows. So this was a good sign that people were moving in that direction. The pressure to have as many applications as possible permitted so that the Humboldt cultivators would be well positioned to get the state license was a big part of our work. And those who have stepped up to become licensed businesses have put an enormous amount of trust, energy, and finances on the line. And the fear of the market being dominated by entities to enormous dispensaries is very real in Humboldt County. In tandem with good actors, we've also seen a marked increase in illegal grows, and that has led us to put significant funding towards expanded enforcement programs. We expanded and revamped our planning department, our code enforcement unit, and we've even recently added extra sheriff's deputies to address the problem. We're currently in the process of drafting our environmental impact report, and we hope to have that completed and up for review in September. Some of the challenges that we'll be facing, all of us will be encouraging cultivators to come forward, working out collaborations with state agencies, working out banking issues, and working with other local jurisdictions. So when we talked about doing this panel, we also felt like we should identify at least one challenge that we have dealt with. And I would say our challenge, specifically in my district, is working with the municipalities. Now I will say, as I said before, that when we started off this whole process, we had a lot of meetings, and it was on the newspaper every day, but somehow some people just felt like if they didn't look, if they put the blinders on, it would go away. Well, it hasn't gone away, and so one of our local cities, Fortuna in my district, has been very concerned about the fact that now grows are being located in and around, not in their city, but on the edges. So as we go forward with our environmental impact report, we'll be looking at putting some extra regulations, requirements for people within the sphere of influence of the city. It's an interesting conundrum because what we're talking about is agriculture, and I'm on LAFCO as well, Local Area Formation Commission, and our key goal is to preserve agricultural lands. But in every city, as we know, the city expands and it may be zoned agricultural, but it's become a de facto neighborhood. So how do we balance the concern to the neighborhood with the new industry moving in? So that's one of the challenges we came up against. And I would encourage everybody who hasn't already started to go ahead and work with your cities, even if they don't want to work with you. Bring them in and get them on the page right away. And I'm going to toss it over now to Carmel, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what it's been like for her.
Thank you, Supervisor Fennell, and thank you everyone for being here in CSAC and Humboldt County for your graciousness. I would have never thought a few years ago that we would all be sitting here, and I'm sure most of you in the room can say the same thing. I remember when we used to call it marijuana, right, and now it's cannabis. So I was asked to talk a little bit about our 6-county regional effort and what we did, and so I just want to take 2 minutes on that. I want to say that when we started a few years ago, we began speaking at CSAC and RCRC, and it was Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino County. And how that started was, certainly with me, I had a community person who kept calling me. This was a few years ago. And she would call and she would say, I want to tell you, I was just at the state and I want to tell you what's going on. And honestly, I blew her off for a while, and then she would start sending emails and she would say, you know, I was just at the state, I really want to tell you what's going on. So I started meeting with her, and what I realized is that this particular advocate was spending more time in Sacramento than I was, or any of my 5 board members. And while she was in Sacramento, she was attending meetings and having private meetings and speaking with some of our legislators and really talking about cannabis and really affecting change and legislation. And then she started calling and saying, well, I just got a call from the governor's office, or I just got a call from this statewide office. And it was all about them calling her then and inviting her to Sacramento to hear what she had to say. And at that point I realized that the industry was really working with the state and making the decisions around legislation. Now, as with any industry, you want that. You want the industry involved. But where was local government? And yes, we have CSAC and we have RCRC, and they do a great job representing us. But nobody was calling Carmel Angelo, Mendocino County CEO, to say what's happening in Mendocino County with marijuana. And no one was calling my 5 supervisors and saying, hey, we'd like to know what you think about this. So I think at that point, that was one of the reasons why we began to get together, because we really did want to have a voice, and it really comes down to wanting a seat at the table. And I think that was a table, for the most part, that we really weren't prominent at that time. And so the 6-county regional policy statement and the meetings that we had we brought together, and that was Del Norte, Trinity, Humboldt, Mendocino, Lake, and Sonoma County, and we began to meet. We had 2 summits, and we developed the policy statement. And the policy statement was developed not only for us as a region to really look at cannabis, because most of those counties that I've named are cultivating counties, and we say we're cultivating counties because that is the underground economy in our counties. But not only to develop this regional statement that could move us forward as a region and give us some strength, but also to work with legislation. And I believe that we were very successful, and also with the help of CSAC and RCRC. I don't want to leave them out, because you have been extremely helpful in our process through this policy statement and working with our legislators. So just very briefly, I just want to say that the policy statement, and I'm going to assume that everybody in here has seen it because we blanketed 58 counties with the policy statement. We focused on local control, and we know that we have that today. We focused on revenue and taxation, we have that. Environmental protections, I believe we have that, and economics. And I think that's an area that we're still working on, but really, chain of custody, education and prevention programs, and money going into education and prevention. So I'm very proud of the work that's been done with our 6-county region and the development of our approach and really being able to affect change. And lastly, I just want to say that we were asked about lessons learned, and I think there's 2 big lessons coming from Mendocino County, and I appreciate Supervisor Fennell's review of what Humboldt County has done. Mendocino County has had a similar approach. But the 2 lessons I would say that before you really embark down the road on cannabis is really to decide what the public and political will is to look at this industry as an economic driver. And if you look at it as an economic driver, then you build your regulations around that. Are you treating it like any other industry, and are you really treating it as the economic driver that it really is in a lot of our counties? You know, it's not a moral issue, it's not a right and wrong issue. We've gone way past that now. So one, you know, how are you going to look at cannabis and the cannabis industry as an overall legislative body that's making the rules and developing policy in your county and your communities? How are you looking at it? And then the second lesson, which is a really big lesson, and Estelle mentioned this as well, it's not over. Once the board adopts an ordinance, it's not over. That's when the work begins. And so, you know, as a CEO, I'm extremely operational. I believe that's what I do. The board develops the policy and I implement the policy. And really, when you look at operationalizing a major cannabis program and then a cannabis code enforcement program, you really have to staff up. You can't look at the cost. You can look at that later. You have to use your best resources, and sometimes those resources are not within the county system. And you have to monitor it daily. You have to get in front of the issues, and you have to have an 800 number. You have to centralize, and that's what we did. So I think my 5 minutes are way up. I'm going to turn this over to Supervisor Morris. Thank you.
Thank you, Karma. And thank you for your efforts on our policy paper a couple years ago. Can everyone hear me okay? So yeah, it's really great to see a full room like this. When I started on the board in '09, and that was the first year I believe CSAC had a medical marijuana working group, it was a much smaller group. The cultivating counties might have been perceived as we were way out there, but we were really trying to move some regulations forward that was actually part of the Prop 215 legislation. Prop 215 is now 20 years old, and we just got some regulations the fall of 2015. So us original cultivating counties have been dealing with this issue through land use ordinances, trying to regulate without really some state oversight. Trinity County started a personal grow ordinance a couple years ago. We tasked the Planning Commission with doing an aggregate grow, so that's about 5-6 years ago, which was really ahead of its time, similar to when Mendocino started their tagging program, and then the feds started rolling in and kind of trying to slap our hands. So we backed off on that aggregate grow ordinance, which would have helped us in the long run, but you had the threat of the federal government coming in until that Cole memo came out. And that Cole memo has changed a little bit, and the last one in 13 pretty much states if you have a regulatory framework, we will kind of back off short of really, really hardcore criminal activity going on. So that helped. Now that the state has its regulatory framework under MRSA, that has helped us, as at least Trinity County, move forward. That's the same year I was tasked as chair, and we tasked the commission to try to develop a regulatory framework locally. And interesting enough, we would never have seen this coming, but when it was at a discussion in the spring of 16, it really became a discussion of a moral issue in 2016, and it took us way back. So there's a lot of education you really need to do with the public side where they're not really accepting this issue. And even in 2016, it really slowed our progress down, and we really didn't have much of an ordinance created. At that point, we know we needed to, it was summer of 2016, we know we needed to create something. We had farmers who wanted to come into compliance and prepare themselves for 2018, so I took it upon myself, kind of went in hiding for a couple weeks over the summer of 2016 and crafted our urgency ordinance that is what we are working under today. And I crafted that for a variety of reasons. Of course, the environmental issues are very important to me. It has a lot of environmental bells and whistles, if you will, in our ordinance, but we also could have and were threatened with some CEQA challenges on the legal side. And I won't go into that. I'm happy to offline tell you about that. But so we've been working under an urgency ordinance. We capped it at 500. That's been our approach for some CEQA issues. It's quite possible we will increase that number of applications after we get our CEQA analysis done. But it is an ever-changing environment we're working in. We will revise our UO in August, do some amendments that we've heard from public. My partner on the ad hoc, Supervisor Gross, and I tried to do kind of a listening tour throughout the county, listening to folks on either side of the issue with their input on what they'd like to see as we move toward a permanent ordinance and craft and develop the other licenses. Don't forget, we just don't have cultivation. We have some other licenses that the state is going to be issuing that we're gearing up for. And so that's in a very short snapshot of how we got to the UO ordinance. I've been seeing this issue since '09 on the board. You know, we've seen all the ebbs and flows that if you of course recall, you've had laws that have distorted the market over the last 40 years. The triangle certainly has its history in growing since 2015. It's really exploded. And so with the change in laws, you're also going to see a change in the market. And that goes kind of back to our 6-page policy where we were really trying to look at how do we protect, contain some of those farmers that want to move into Cannabis 4.0 into the legal market, and still, as Carmel pointed out, has some economic impacts to our counties and other counties. We're going to see a change in the market. We're already seeing it with the impact of MRSA, Prop 64. Unfortunately, and you know, we can be creative trying to help the market locally, at least for cultivators. You know, most industries are really, when they're mature, if you're an economics fan, most industries certainly become consolidated and are managed and run, you know, by a few handful of companies of 80% of the business. So prohibition took about 20 years to smooth out. I think we're going to see a lot of rocky rides and roads on this issue. So prepare to surf the high and low points with everybody involved, because it's going to continue to change. And I would say the challenges is just the always changes that we're going to face in the next few years. So put your seatbelts on if you're going to jump into this. Some counties may choose not to, but certainly makes for a very interesting ride. With that, I think my 5 minutes are probably close to being up, but I think that the challenges is just weathering this transition from a prohibition market to a legal market, and then everything that falls within in between that. We just saw the changes in the trailer bill at the state level. That certainly is going to affect our move in August on some of the amendments we'll make to our urgency ordinance as we move toward our permanent ordinance. So with that, I will pass it to Supervisor Gore. Not Groves, that's my guy, Anna.
Supervisor Grow. Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Whether you call it devil weed, dope, pot, weed, kush, marijuana, cannabis, whether you call it medical, legitimately medical for trying to help somebody who's a cancer patient, over to somebody who gets a recommendation. They're not called prescriptions, they're called recommendations, medical recommendations online with a video chat. You pay $20 and you get something printed up on your computer for plantar fasciitis. Whether you are dealing with the marijuana industry and you're finding yourself dealing with professionals who have huge sums of money, who are either very detailed, complex lawyers, or all the way over to people with gobs of money who are legitimate stoners, who you're like, can you not smoke before you come into a meeting with me? We all have to realize that we are in the Wild West, right? When we passed our zoning ordinance at the local level, one of my colleagues appropriately said, after 10 years on this board, this is the first and only time I have, or probably ever will, create land use from the ground up, right? We are all bound by land use and these other things from the past, from what happened in the 1800s, 1900s. We really have an opportunity, especially on the growing side, from the local level, to decide where it's appropriate, where it's not, why, how, to what levels, what's the taxation, and it creates a very big, complex issue for us to dive into. Every place has its own model of how it's done this process or is walking into this process. Sonoma County, we passed a zoning ordinance before we put a tax on the ballot. And so what we did is actually said that if the tax doesn't pass, we will not permit, right? So in a way, it was forcing this idea that you won't get permits, you won't be really legal unless this passes. It's a way to hold off political opposition. We passed by 70%, even though we did have some political opposition. It wasn't significant. It was a special election in March. It passed 70% to 30%. People are ready to move on and stop voting on this and stop talking about it in our communities, is what I find. You know, it's been talked about for decades. They just want to move on. And that's why even with a special election where a no vote is usually more beneficial to for a no vote, is that we're seeing people just say, come on, get on with it, figure it out. It's in my community, it's pervasive. Whatever you call it, it's here. I see it growing, I see it in other places. You know, we've learned a lot through CSAC discussions and NACO discussions with Colorado, Washington, Oregon, other places that are going through this. One of the amazing things is to sit down with a bunch of supervisors or commissioners from a place like Colorado and sit around the table where you have both liberal and conservative counties represented, and have some of them say, well, I'm a liberal county, we passed it and did the ordinance really quickly. Have another person from a conservative county say, well, I'm a libertarian, I could really care less what we do, and then have somebody more who comes in and says, nah, I could never vote for this, I'd be voted out of office, and I don't believe it. It's devil weed, it's evil, right? And so you have this variety of different things going on, but what you see is also some of these counties in Colorado that haven't passed land use ordinances to regulate it still have the same problems, maybe even more problems is what they've said, because it's legal and there's dispensaries all around the place, but they don't have the funding, the revenue, the control mechanisms to steer it. So the question is do you fight or do you steer, right? Sonoma County, 80% of the marijuana grown in Sonoma County pre our ordinance was grown in either RRD or in rural residential, ag residential areas. RRD, Resource and Rural Development, pretty much the mountainsides, the wilderness, right? The hills. Rural residential, the reason it was grown there is because it's under your nose. It's the easiest place, small lots around the county. We have a ton of them. Mom and pop shops. Out in the hills, easiest place to hide, not under your nose, but away from everyone, right? So you have two different issues in those two areas. Number one, in the rural and resource development areas, you have environmental damage, you have road damage, you have erosion, you have all these significant issues. If you haven't seen some of these grows in the kind of toxic brownfield environments that follow, go out and check it out sometime if it's done in the wrong way. In the rural residential areas, what do we have? We have 80% of the homicides in Sonoma County over the last 5 to 6 years are because of marijuana-related theft. 90+% of the home invasions in Sonoma County because of it, right? So you're talking about not always and not usually and hardly ever is it just the wackadoo who's growing there on the ground in the rural residential neighborhoods. It's the people who drove in from Pennsylvania and stole 10 pounds and are driving back across county line and they killed 2 people. We had that happen 4 different times in Sonoma County. So what happened is when we went into a land use ordinance process, the industry came out and really, and it's all fragmented, but there's a couple groups that coalesce and really tried to get grandfathered in, right? Say, hey, we're growing here, we want to get grandfathered in. It's hard for me to grandfather shadows. And secondly, I really led the charge not to allow cannabis, marijuana, weed to be grown in rural residential areas and in ag residential areas. It's not compatible in Sonoma County. Took a hard line, it was a 3-2 vote, right, on our board. It was the most contentious thing. But the reality is that we are trying to steer this into agriculture and industrial areas where it's appropriate, with conditional or minor use permits, with proper oversight, and moving it out of the world of law enforcement and into the world of compliance, right? It's go time. So, so at the regional level, you know, obviously one of the things all of us are dealing with, and we might talk a little bit about, is not getting played by LLCs that are buried under 5 or 6 different areas of hidden companies and coming up and just slashing and burning and then moving on to the next site. Took me significant efforts from a county to be able to bypass the administrative process to go after a bad grow with basically guys dressed in black and AK-47s up on a hill and to get them down. And then what happened is 3 weeks later, the same LLC was going up on another mountain, right? They make $1 million in the same amount of time that you spend $150,000 to try and bypass bureaucracy to get a temporary restraining order and an injunction in court and get them off and do remediation. I'll stop by saying one thing is that we got a lot to do at the regional and state level. The market is such a powerful mover and shaker at this point. I think we'll get into this a little bit, but the oil economy versus the Appalachian economy, you know, it's just a fascinating thing. If you haven't been to a dispensary or a processing plant, go see what's coming down.
Thank you, everybody. So we have a little while up until about 10:30 for questions and answers. Any questions? Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
You know, if we regulate this and the folks coming in the door, we find out where they are, find out who they are, we say go do it, and we're going to check on you. If you do it wrong, we'll kick you out. That's fine. It's the thing that concerns us are the folks that we don't know, the folks that do it right up next to the ones that are lethal. How do you get them? You know, so we're trying to put all of the upfront money into code enforcement and sheriffs, and then go chase them down. So my question is, are you able to prosecute under today's laws? Because our DA is reluctant to take a case forward and spend all that money just to have it tossed down. They've got some pretty good lawyers on that side. So what kind of problems are you having when you're going after the bad guys?
Well, I'll jump off first. That's not that's not an unusual issue. We're all experiencing that. What we're doing here in Humboldt County is we have upped our enforcement tremendously. We've also upped our penalties under code enforcement. So what used to be a maximum $10,000 penalty is now a maximum $900,000 penalty. That'll get people's attention pretty quickly. What we see as the overall work, as James mentioned, steering the issue, what we see as the overall work is partly the criminal aspect, which the sheriff will be handling, and partly the civil aspect, which the code enforcement will be handling. But the bottom line is, over time, and I would argue pretty quickly, you're going to see not just people who don't like marijuana telling us about things. You're going to see people who have gone through all the trouble of going through the process to come in and say, that's unfair. You need to take care of these people. Not only are they damaging the environment because they're not doing it through the regulatory process, but they're also competing with us, and we're trying to do things right. And think about the end user, because we sat up here for a long, long time and people were doing this in the black market. But what you had were all the end users who were criminals per se, having to meet some guy on the corner of the street in San Francisco to give him a package. The end users want a clean, healthy package of whatever it is they need. And we went on the tour yesterday and we saw just how people who are regulated are doing that. And it was really actually very inspiring to me to see how careful they were to make sure that the product was free of contaminants and all of these things. But bottom line, going back, how do you do it? Civil and criminal. And the other thing that we've done is we have worked with the Sheriff's Department. Everyone who has come in for an application is on a list, and we work together. The sheriff goes somewhere, sees something, if it's not on the list, they're good to go to eradicate that. Because in Humboldt County right now, if you're not in the permitting process, you are subject to prosecution or just having your crop cut down.
In Mendocino County, the board authorized almost $700,000 of general fund to develop our cannabis compliance and code enforcement unit. And so we have a coordinator over code enforcement, and we developed and adopted by the board administrative policies, which we certainly could share with Lake County. And so we've moved it from, or at least attempting to move from a criminal process to an administrative process. And then we also have an 800 number. And the 800 number is all things cannabis. It's actually 1-844-421 weed. And so we're doing, yes, that's what it is. We're doing a promotional campaign on that. And the reason is that we want all the calls to come in through that 800 number. And then the calls would go to code enforcement, those that are appropriate, and then it would be code enforcement that would determine if it was administrative or criminal, and then the calls are referred to the Sheriff's Department, Sheriff's Office for criminal. And the reason we've done that is really to try to streamline the process and get those complaints to the proper entity. And so we don't want to inundate our Sheriff's Office with this. There are people out there that are going to continue doing what they do. But again, we develop the administrative process, and then calls will be referred to the Sheriff's Office based on whether the code enforcement officer thinks that it's criminal or not. So again, resources up front, and that's really the only way to deal with code enforcement with cannabis.
Very similar, what you just heard. You're right. Going through the criminal system, getting convictions unless it's a serious felony. We've employed a code enforcement program for the last couple of years that have resulted in some really regulating the market on that level as well, where you go through our system, if there's a code enforcement violation and you don't either bring it back down to our personal gross limit, or you're not in our new system, then you'll have some issues with us. And it goes as far as having judicial abatement. So after you go through our code enforcement process and next year or the same year you're trying to grow again, there's no real hoop jumping for staff except law enforcement then will just go and pull your plants. As Estelle pointed out, as more of our farmers get regulated, they're going to get a little grumpy of someone who is working outside the rules, because they are jumping through a lot of hoops that they really hadn't had to jump through. And so we want to make sure that we are all working together, and maybe some of those others that are out there will come into our system, but code enforcement is very much a big piece of this whole puzzle to streamline some of this regulation.
50 to 60% of the nation's marijuana is grown in between Sonoma County and the Oregon border. Isn't that crazy? So when this discussion started, I was somebody who thought, well, if it's legalized, it'll push compliant people who want to be good operators in, and it'll diminish the others, right? Just naturally, the market would kind of deal with some of those issues. Marijuana is not legal everywhere, so the black market will persist, is what somebody who's an expert in the market told me. And I said, well, that's a very good point. There's also somebody who comes up to me and says, God, you know, he's a corporate kind of mergers and acquisitions guy. He says, what he hears is that the reason that Bayer bought Monsanto is to line up for this industry. Or excuse me, vice versa. No, Bayer bought Monsanto. I don't know if that's true. There's so many rumors, there's so much stuff going on. But the reality is that if you look at the way that this is done, you do have to permit people, and then a track and trace program is absolutely relevant. If you don't know what a track and trace program is, it means that you regulate from the dispensary out. So people are primarily not going to be buying bags on a corner. They're going to be buying from dispensaries. So you certify that in those dispensaries that it had a origin and a transportation and distribution node, and it came through. So that's for the California market, right? And we have medical dispensaries right now, and we're going to have adult use. It's not recreational because it's not fun. It's adult use dispensaries after January. So that's one part of it. And there will be some natural flows, but money, so money is number one, is dramatically increasing your fees, having them be daily fees. The other thing is that I would say, we not only allocated an initial 7 positions, code enforcement, ag department and others, and also health and other things that are going to come online as the money comes in from our tax, but we also put $1 million into being able to bypass the administrative proceedings and come straight to us as a board, or give that authority to our planning director, so that they can go directly with our county council to court and get a temporary restraining order and injunctions. The reason for that is that if you try to play the cat and mouse code compliance catch-up game, you lose, right? You send a code enforcement officer out, he calls the property owner, he tries to get the sheriff to go with him, he goes, he comes back, then he says, oh, well, we need to do this. It's a nightmare. It costs you staff time and it yields no result. You have to just stop somebody from making gobs of money as you're doing it. So we've done that in 3 or 4 different locations. It's not cheap, but it's what we need to do to send a signal. The other thing, and I don't know if this is true, but you just hear things moving on. And so I've just heard recently that Mendocino County's been cracking down on illegal growers. And I don't know if that's the truth, but that's what I hear in Sonoma County. So all of a sudden, that stuff just passes around, and you have to do a show of force. I would say it's just kind of like if as supervisor, some of you talk with, deal with traffic issues. If I call it the CHP, I can get them to do a 3-month, focused effort on an area in my district, and they let people know they're there, and they don't just do it for a day. That's the kind of stuff that you need to do. You need to show them you're there.
Thank you, James. You read my mind, because that is absolutely true. Send the message. If we know, I'm absolutely amazed at what has happened in the cannabis industry. It started off that people were growing in little patches, and then CAM came along and they started growing indoors, and then and on and on and on. So you can drive it, and the message that people are going to get from Humboldt County is we're doing very, very strong enforcement. The sheriff has some pictures. If you want to go talk to him in the break, he'll show you where they went yesterday. And we have asked him to make sure that people understand what he's doing, and they're going out and they're going to find some of the people who are really basically giving us the finger. We can't do that. We have to let people know that that's not acceptable in Humboldt County. Questions?
Thank you, Estelle. I've heard you, this panel, talk about economic driver. And Estelle, I'll start the question with you, because you mentioned that you've added additional enforcement, both in code enforcement and in additional sheriff's deputies, and I think Supervisor Gore, you mentioned the same thing, additional code enforcement. And you've also levied an excise tax. So, economic driver notwithstanding, I'd like to have you, if you would, please, Estelle, quantify how much money have you spent in Humboldt County in added enforcement, both in code enforcement and in sheriff's deputies, and what income are you deriving from the excise tax? If you can address that specific, is it even or even negative?
Okay, so first of all, with regard to the planning part of it, it's self-sustaining, basically. The fees cover everything. With regard to enforcement, we have two measures. We have Measure Z, which is dedicated to public safety, and we've been able to increase our law enforcement quite substantially out into the rural areas. Measure S is our cannabis excise tax. The way we're levying that is based on the permit, and that is based on the amount of ground that is used in that particular activity. So what we're doing with that is once the people get their permit, they must pay the tax. When we first started, we didn't know how quickly we could move those permits through. As I said, we had 2,300 applications, but to date, we actually only have somewhere shy of 40 permits issued. However, to date, we also have 560 completed applications, which we can now look to being permitted somewhere within the next few months. And those, at this point, not even the 560, the last time we did a count, we did an estimate. We went from estimating that in the first year or first half year we'd have 371,000 from the excise tax. That jumped up to 2.2 million. The last time we looked at the budget, we are now at 4.8 million. So we are being able to hire new sheriffs and also hire new code enforcement people. We've expanded our code enforcement, and I did want to say another thing that we've done. James described the typical code enforcement process that takes a long time. We have shortened the time from a potential 75 days to 10 days for marijuana. Because we were being played in the first year, and it went into code enforcement, people would just use that ability to come back and back and back until they could harvest. So now we're just saying 10 days and that's it. So that's kind of our funding source. It obviously depends on how many you have to deal with, but with the excise tax and the planning fees for planning department, we're able to manage it quite well.
On your, on your fine where you levied up to $900,000, how do you actually collect those, or how do you enforce that?
One of the things we did, because we're in that formation phase, and we didn't want to be too harsh on people who were maybe trying to do the right thing, but are caught up in a ball of wax with state agencies and local regulations, and may have been trying to do the right thing, but didn't quite get it, because we're finding people who are in the process as well, if they jump the gun, for instance. So we gave our planning director some discretion in terms of appropriating penalties. And so far, you can ask him later, but as I understand it, a check is written, and it is taken care of.
Not cash.
There may be some cash on it, you have to ask him. But the bottom line is, it is totally doable. We've never come to the level of the 900,000. That would take quite a while to get there, at 10,000 a day. But the bottom line is that what we want to say is that there were people who got involved in this industry who thought, and it's not just limited to this industry, by the way, it's probably any industry, I'd be better off if I just pay the fine. I'll go ahead and pay the fine. So we want to make it that that's not really the preferred option.
John Peters from Mono County. We are, as James said, we're at this land use from ground up stage. we seem to have got past the moral right and wrong issue, and then some industry individuals came in. We had no experience with grows outside of cartel and the Forest Service, out of view, or most people didn't see what was going on. We had one this year illegal grow. We got an injunction, shut them down, but the industry folks that have come in have changed that perception, the right or wrong perception, and it's become a nuisance concern. How do you advise a county like us to approach the nuisance ordinance aspect of the odor, the setbacks? Even though it could be restricted land use to ag and industrial, those ag lands are still potentially within the in-smell zone, in-sight zones, the viewscape. So how are those being written into the local ordinances? And then how do you enforce these odor issues?
Number one is, obviously setbacks is a very important thing. We spent a lot of time on setbacks, both on the, from grows, but also from different kinds of dispensaries and other things. Schools was a significant thing with setbacks. We had our superintendent of the county schools very engaged in this, and that helped us on an advocacy side, that we had teachers and others coming in and talking about setbacks. Part of it is figuring out where you're going with compliance. There's a lot of grow operations. If you're looking at mixed light and other kind of greenhouse operations, they can get away with very, technology these days, very reduced amount of odor. Outdoor is an issue. So if you're looking at outdoor grows, realistically, that's you have to look at who has authority to manage those kinds of nuisances. I'm the chair of our air district, which actually has authority over odor and other things. So there's some crosswalks you have to look at, but you can't require that in your ordinance. And even if the thing is that's I think difficult to quantify for some of us, is that this question and then the previous question is that the realistic part of it is we don't know. We're trying to figure all of this out. I think to the gentleman's question from Del Norte before is, I think it's a very germane one. It's like, so what we did is we had estimates from our staff that it's going to bring in $4 to $6 million, the tax, year by year. They wanted to propose to us at the budget this year to approve 15 FTEs. I said, excuse me, you want to hire 15 full-time employees, pensioned, everything, on the assumption that we're going to have a dramatic compliance boost, and this is going to go in? No, every single one has to come through us on like a quarterly update. Our administrator has to see it. I want to go focus on code compliance and permitting, first of all, right? So Permit and Resources Management Division for us, Ag Department. I don't want to spend money on all the health department people to do the analysis of how it is in the community yet. I need to see if we can get people compliant. And the realistic thing, like they said, like Couple said, is that this is one of those things where if there's a big problem in your community already, if it's pervasive, grows and other things, then you kind of, my thing is figure out a way to improve and just have an adaptive management process. Like we're going to have an ongoing steering committee or ad hoc on this for at least 5 years and be tweaking a land use ordinance all the time. So what we do is make sure that the permits that go out are only 1-year permits. They're not land use permits, use permits that run with the property. You have to get a renewal. That pisses off some people, but you know what? It gives us, it keeps us back. So what I would encourage is anybody who's at this table who thinks about what are the right ways to deal with nuisance, setbacks, other things, is not only do we have a cannabis conference on July 19th with CSAC in Sacramento, but is also, I'd be happy to host people, but get your planners and your staff together with our staff to figure out what we've gone through. Don't go through the process of trying to learn it from the ground up. If you have other counties, whether they're rural, suburban, or urban, obviously resources are different for everybody. If you have money to be able to front load or back load, but I think that's important. The other thing is that if you're from a county that you don't have a significant grow issue in your face right now, you do have the opportunity to kind of wait and see what happens with places, obviously. Like we said before, as I was talking to Leticia, I love you. Kern County, you know, she was talking about the grow operations that are going in there. There's two different markets forming right now. One of them is the commodity market, which is the oil market, right? And the other one is this attempt to really create kind of the appellation concept of wines. But if you look at it, it really is a chemical process. If you go to some of these, they can remove the terpenes, which are the scent compounds and the other things from the overall oil, add it back in. It can be a completely industrialized process. So it's, you know, it's really interesting to see where land use and where things are going to be driving.
I just want to follow up on a comment that Supervisor Gore made. Mendocino County started our program on May 4th, so not too long ago, and right after that, our sheriff's office did conduct raids. And so we had to speak to that because here we are doing a cannabis program and trying to develop a legal and a legitimate process, and at the same time, our sheriff's office did conduct raids. So that was something that happened. And that could happen anywhere, and it's not only the sheriff's office, so it is something to think about moving forward. I also wanted to say that in a county like ours, in Mendocino County, where we still are a small county, we still have 3,510 square miles, we had to staff up. So we couldn't look at our existing staff to manage the cannabis program, whether it was planning and building, whether it was ag, we had to staff up. And if we just left it to the staff we had, they would not be able to do anything other than cannabis. And so we wouldn't see any other projects getting done. That's not all counties, but certainly that was our county, and it may be yours too. So I would encourage you that as you build your program, that you look at the resources you have. And I do believe that it makes sense, and in the end, it's better to put the resources up front rather than attempting to struggle through it.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Just to try and cap a couple of the points, as Carmel said, sheriff departments are still going to enforce. Fish and Wildlife certainly has gained some new money from the state to do some enforcement on their own, and we've had a little difference of agreement on some of the issues in our county, but I think we're working through them. They certainly tackled a couple of our permitted folks. And so I think this is a year, 2017 is going to be a very interesting gray area for everybody, whether it's a grower who's trying to get what they can out of this year before state licensing comes in, and enforcement too. It's their last kind of year as well. So there's a lot of different enforcement going on. In terms of money that Roger asked about, we're a very small county, as most of you know, with a very limited tax base. At the moment, we are just working off of the fees that we're collecting from our 500 applications. So that's roughly going to be about $2.5 million. We're slowly staffing up. Our staff has stepped up. They had to get very, very quickly educated on this topic and in the planning department. And we're using some of our building inspectors to do some compliance issues. And we will slowly build up. Again, we want to make sure that we're not going to see a curveball in what it does to the market. So we don't want to bank too far. We're being very conservative with our resources and slowly adding people. We too will look at having a taxation go before the voters. Hopefully this year is our goal. So that will bring some extra revenue in as well.
I'll say very quickly just on the issues of LLCs that were brought up by Supervisor Gore, our permits are tied to the property owner. So it's not something that can just disappear. It's the property owner has to sign off and the property owner has to pay the tax. So that's important. I also wanted to say in answer to your issue about odor, you can write that into your ordinance. We have odor, we have noise generators, we have lighting, we require international dark sky, so that's an important. Nuisance is the old way that things were done, and before we came up with this comprehensive ordinance, we had an ordinance for residential areas less than 5 acres, where people could claim a nuisance. odor is a tricky one. If it's, you know, either in a greenhouse or indoor, you can filter it. If it's outdoor, it's different. But so far I've seen basically that the outdoor tends to happen in areas that are a little bit further out and are probably more accepting of it. So I don't think we're going to see that in more of the neighborhood places.
You know, one thing I think is important to talk about that is germane is a couple of the intersections with the state, right? So number one is, you know, I grew up in agriculture. I think some of you have ag counties and other things, but you know, if you make specific regulations for marijuana, don't be surprised if you get a letter from the Farm Bureau that says, we're worried that your high-level regulation of marijuana, even though we're worried about marijuana, could creep into other areas of agriculture, okay? So if you set slope limits, 15% slope limits, other things like that, because you say, you know, it's this difference between there's a lot of people lobbying at the state level and also us at county levels to quantify it as an agricultural commodity as opposed to a product, right? Right now, that is a big thing that's going on that should be paid attention to. Because for me, I want to be able to regulate marijuana differently than I want to regulate orchards or vineyards, personally. The second thing is that we need to keep our eye on the ball, and this has been a big aspect of our group with the policy that we've proposed and got passed by the Ag and Natural Resources and Energy Committee, is a couple core elements. One is local control with zoning and growth and other things, but the other thing is let's talk about revenue sharing, right? No matter where you are, come January 1st, marijuana, cannabis is going to be recreation legal in the state. They are already, through the ballot measure, taxing it at a level where our estimation is that we will not be able to add additional taxes in our communities on top of that. So what we need is to make sure that that money comes back from the state to the grow areas or the impacted areas. And this is a very dangerous thing, as we all know, is because the big people who get the biggest roads funding are Orange County. No disrespect if, you know, somebody from Orange County is here, but with very little roads, and they have the highest population, we need to make sure that that comes back into the source areas and deals with the environmental degradation and deals with the community capabilities and other things. We can control and have our own taxes for medical, but we got to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball for adult use.
I want to tag on something that Supervisor Gore mentioned. We are seeing certainly a lot of new regulations at the state level, and you saw one that came out in August of 2015 in our regional water board here in our section, which is great in terms of preserving watersheds and protecting watersheds. But I've had quite a few folks in agriculture start to worry, and I think everyone needs to be aware that this is going to start to be mission creeping over into traditional agriculture when it comes to water. I'm not saying that's good or bad, I just think it's something we all need to be aware of. I think they've seen the most blatant, with some actors, not all of them are bad actors, in the cannabis industry affecting watersheds, especially up here. However, be aware, you have some regional water compliance being offered through this industry, or required, not offered, but required, that traditional agriculture probably should be paying attention to, especially when it comes to water.
Before I take another question, I just want to jump back to the first little thing I said about what the challenges, unintended consequences. Think it out if you haven't done it already. One thing that we were trying to do in order to improve the environment was we were requiring that cannabis be grown on prime agricultural land. And that's not as widespread as you might think, especially in a forested county. And so what we wound up discovering is that some of the most desirable prime agricultural land was right around the interface of the city. And that makes sense. Where do humans settle? They settle where they can grow food and where there's water nearby. So think about that. We are dialing that back under our environmental impact review, and what we'll be looking at is just the slope and agricultural zoning. But think about where that will land if that's where you're going to restrict it to. Might be a little bit more open on that. Any questions? Okay, we're running close to our time, so I did want to bring up one of the issues that James brought up, and that is working with the state. I think it's extremely important that we continue that, not only in terms of revenue sharing, but also in terms of what it looks like on the ground when you're dealing with water quality, fish and wildlife, archaeological resources, on and on and on. And how much will that impact your process to get everybody into compliance? And so working together is a huge and a key issue. Any thoughts on that, guys?
The reality is that what's going on at the state is the same kind of iterative process that we're going through at the county level, where they don't know what they're doing either. So, you know, I mean, everyone is going forward into this, trying to figure out and learning on the fly. So it is imperative that we have a strong voice at the table. If you haven't checked out the policy that we passed, that's a CSAC policy, I'd encourage you to do so and think about where you're at, because these bills, the first bill, MRSA, which became MCRSA because they wanted it to say cannabis instead of marijuana, because that's pejorative if you call it marijuana, went through, and it was written by Jim Wood and Mike McGuire, two representatives from up here who are looking for information, right? You know, Jim and I sat down and he really talked about the deforestation and the LLCs and how to write stuff. They're looking for ideas on what to pitch, and they are being looked at by the colleagues around the state right now to deal with the issue in terms of legalization. The money is going to be a different thing. Let's be very real. You know, once there's funds coming in through recreation dispensaries around the state, you know, it's a great way to put money into different areas, and we need to find a way that we keep the foot to the fire in terms of the remediation and the impacts being paid for. It really, you know, if you're working at all in this world, it's not just the legislature. We have Governor Brown, who's had a soft touch on this. We have the next governor coming in, whether that is Gavin Newsom, Villaraigosa, or any of the other people that are out there, are going to be ushering this brave new world. And so make sure if you're interacting with them in this time, you are stressing what you need in your areas and putting pressure on them. That's one of the things we've talked about with CSAC as well. So, you know, the state is going to continue to figure things out. They sat down with us, and basically Estelle is like, well, we've developed a track and trace program. We'd like to have it connect with yours. And the state folks said, nah, we're going to do our own track and trace program. So does that mean you waste $50,000? I hope not, but that's the reason that we're having these discussions right now, is to crosswalk those systems.
Where we have a banking.
Banking, okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you, we do have the Senior Vice President of the Community Credit Union from Garberville here today, and she's a compliance officer, has been throughout the nation at conferences in DC, etc., talking about this issue. It is a huge and important issue for us to stay focused on. You know, being a Schedule I drug, as we all know, it can't be used in banking. That prevents so much more. If this does become an economic driver for any of our counties, for instance, some of the poorer counties, you name it, what do we do with all of these legitimate funds, legal funds that have been raised? Do we keep them out of the banks where they can be used to continue to build the economy, where they can be used for loaning to other industries, where they can be used for housing, et cetera, et cetera? It really, we have to keep on this story that this is now legitimate, statewide and in many other states, and we have to make that call that it's much, first of all, it's better for the economy. It's also better for our security. We've got a lot of cash out there that the Board of Equalization is dealing with. We've heard stories from Fiona Ha that you wouldn't believe. And you know, people showing up with $450,000 in a paper bag to Sacramento to pay their taxes. And it's just, there is a move to have a deposit area somewhere in the Emerald Triangle. But the bottom line is, we need to get away from the cash as much as possible, and we can only do that if the banking is, if that banking prohibition is lifted. I wanted to...
Supervisor Fennell, if I may, for just a moment, on the banking issue, we also have the CSAC Finance Corporation that has been looking at this issue and what some of the challenges are locally. And we do have Alan Fernandez, the CSAC Finance Corporation Executive Vice President, who's here as well and can comment on this issue.
Thank you, Graham.
Well, and I'll be brief. Thank you, Graham. Again, Alan Fernandez with the CSAC Finance Corporation. I'll be brief because I know I want to keep us on schedule, but as Graham mentioned, and also to convey to the rest of the group, Matt Cate, the Executive Director of CSAC, sits on the Treasurer's Working Group on cannabis banking, and myself and Kara Martinson are staffing him in that effort. And we've been working through that process, which began in the early part of the year and will conclude later in the year with offering solutions that help ameliorate the banking problem. We've been meeting with many stakeholders, including financial institutions, and as we work through our process, we will certainly be coming back to you all to share sort of the product of our work. But we're looking really to assist with cash, the collection of taxes, predominantly in cash, and then also a compliance mechanism as well, which we think over time will help and assist some cannabis-related businesses to ultimately be banked. But anyway, that's just a brief overview of it, but we'll talk more about it later.
And that definitely goes to, you know, not just working interagency, but working with the national picture. It's extremely important. So we're coming up to the end of our time. In fact, we're at the end of our time, but I'd like to give my panelists 30 seconds to give us a wrap up. Do you want to go to?
Thank you. I just want to say that what I tell my staff is step up, step out, and stay engaged. And honestly, with cannabis, that's what we all need to do, because what you all are doing and what we're doing right now will set the stage for the next 10 to 20 years, and it's incumbent upon us to do it right. And secondly, whatever you develop in your counties, whatever policies, whatever ordinances, whatever administrative processes or whatever that you develop, remember that your staff have to implement that. And so it's really important that that your staff are involved and that they understand what you want as far as what that policy is. Because if they can't implement what you develop, then you're really worse off than you were before you even started. So thank you very much.
Great words as usual, Carmel. I'm happy to help anybody or answer any questions. I've been on the front lines since '09. Supervisor Gord just reminded me, we were at a meeting 5 years ago when people were whispering that Supervisor Lovelace and Morris were trying to legalize weed. And so and we were just trying to get some regulations around this thing. And so if you're new to this world and you have your constituents that are going to be on both sides of the issue, be prepared. You'll be demonized, even by family and friends. You'll be threatened. I have a list of that. So it's a very wild road if you're just putting your foot in at the moment. Now, I think it's less wild than it was 8 years ago, but so I'm happy to help answer any questions on your ordinance. How do you navigate certain areas? You know where to find me. I'm happy to help. Thank you.
Two extremes. One is front page of the Press Democrat, our regional newspaper, that has the Cannabis Cup, and it's showcasing it. And there's a tent in the back of the Cannabis Cup that is only if you have where you can smoke while you're there, but only if you have a script, not a prescription, a recommendation. And you look at it and you're like, there's no cancer patients on on those 5 pictures that I saw, right? On the other side, there are people who legitimately use it. Want to juxtapose that against a dispensary that we visited with a couple other officials. We went in Oregon, and and went into one that's fully legal, like not a medical one. You go in, you show your card, and they take you into the back. And basically, while I was there, I saw one lady who was young and had tattoos. I saw one old farmer with a trucker hat on. I saw a couple that looked like they were about 55, 60 going on a date. And then I saw what looked like just a soccer mom come in. It was fascinating for me to see the diversity that's out there. So what I say that is open your eyes. You got to step into the shadows to try and figure this thing out. It's surrounded by BS, so cut through it.